The sky turned an ominous green as Hazel Donovan watched from her farmhouse porch, a cold dread settling in her stomach that had nothing to do with the morning's meager breakfast. She had seen many storms in her 22 years, but none that painted the heavens with such malevolence. Douglas, Arizona Territory, 1885, was no stranger to violent weather, but this approaching darkness seemed different, angrier somehow. The wind picked up suddenly, sending her chestnut hair whipping across her face as she gripped the porch railing. "Dear Lord," she whispered, watching the distant horizon where a funnel cloud began to take shape, churning the dust and debris below it into a deadly dance. Her father had been gone 3 days now, riding to Tucson for supplies and to see about a loan to save their struggling cattle ranch. The drought had been merciless this year, and without rain soon, they would lose everything her family had spent 15 years building. The distant roar grew louder. Chickens scattered in the yard, sensing the danger before Hazel could fully comprehend it. The tornado was coming straight for her, straight for everything she had left in this world. She turned to rush inside, to gather what few valuables remained: her mother's locket, the deed to the ranch, the small pouch of coins hidden beneath the floorboard, when the thunder of hoofbeats cut through the howling wind. A horse and rider appeared from the east, moving at a breakneck pace toward her property. The man sat tall in the saddle, his dark hat pulled low against the wind, his duster billowing behind him like the wings of some great bird of prey. Hazel froze, one hand on the door. Strangers in these parts were seldom bearers of good news. Bandits and outlaws roamed the territory, preying on isolated homesteads like hers. Her father's rifle was inside, but she wasn't certain she could reach it in time. The rider reined his horse to a halt before her porch, the animal's flanks heaving with exertion. His eyes were fixed not on her, but on the horizon behind the house. "Madam," he called over the rising wind, his voice deep and urgent, "that twister's coming straight for you." "Where's your storm cellar?" Hazel hesitated. The man's face was partially shadowed by his hat, but she could see strong features, a day's growth of beard, and eyes that seemed more concerned than threatening. "Around back," she answered finally, the fear of the approaching tornado outweighing her wariness of this stranger. "No time to waste," he said, swinging down from his saddle with fluid grace. "Grab what you can't live without. You've got 2 minutes." The authority in his voice brooked no argument. Hazel darted inside, snatching her mother's locket from the mantel, the small cash box from beneath the loose floorboard, and her father's worn Bible. When she emerged, the stranger was tying his horse to the side of the house, in what little shelter the structure might offer. "That's not safe for your horse," she protested, raising her voice above the wind. "Maestro's smart." "He'll break free if the house goes," the man replied, turning toward her. "Now come on." The roar was deafening now. Hazel glanced over her shoulder and felt her heart stop. The tornado had grown, a massive, swirling beast of wind and destruction bearing down on them with terrifying speed. The stranger grabbed her hand and pulled her around the side of the house toward the storm cellar. The wooden doors were heavy, designed to withstand the powerful suction of a twister, but he heaved them open as if they weighed nothing. "Get in," he shouted, practically lifting her by the waist and setting her on the first step. Hazel scrambled down, clutching her precious items to her chest. The stranger followed, pulling the doors closed behind them with a resounding thud that seemed to seal away the world above. Darkness enveloped them, broken only by thin slivers of light filtering through the cracks in the cellar doors. The space was small, meant for storing preserves and root vegetables as much as for shelter. Their shoulders brushed in the confined area. "I'm Vaughn Lawson," he said, striking a match and lighting a lantern that hung from a hook on the low ceiling. "I was passing by when I saw the storm forming." "Hazel Donovan," she replied, trying to control her trembling. "Thank you for coming to warn me." The cellar doors rattled violently above them as the wind intensified. A terrible groaning sound filled the air with splintering, glass shattering. Hazel knew it was her home being torn apart, piece by piece. When the doors began to strain against their latches, threatening to rip open and suck them into the vortex above, Vaughn moved without hesitation. He wrapped his arms around Hazel and pulled her into the farthest corner of the cellar, pressing her against the earthen wall, shielding her body with his own. "Hold on," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear as the world seemed to tear itself apart above them. Hazel closed her eyes and clung to this stranger, this man who had appeared out of nowhere to save her life. His heartbeat was steady against her cheek, a counterpoint to the chaos surrounding them. For what seemed an eternity, they remained locked together in the dark as the tornado raged overhead. The walls shuddered, dirt rained down from the ceiling, and the pressure in the small space fluctuated wildly, making Hazel's ears pop painfully. And then, gradually, the fury began to subside. The roaring diminished to a howl, then to a moan, and finally to silence broken only by the patter of rain and their own breathing. Vaughn didn't release her immediately, waiting until he was certain the danger had passed. When he finally loosened his embrace, Hazel found herself reluctant to step away from his warmth, from the solid presence that had anchored her through the storm's violence. "I think it's over," he said quietly, his voice resonating in the small space. Hazel nodded, suddenly aware of how inappropriate their proximity was, a strange man holding her so intimately. She stepped back, smoothing her skirt with shaking hands. "Thank you, Mr. Lawson. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." His eyes, illuminated by the lantern light, studied her face. "Just doing what anyone would do, Miss Donovan." But they both knew that wasn't true. Most travelers would have sought shelter for themselves, not risked their lives to save a stranger. "We should see what's left," Hazel said, steeling herself for what might await them above. Vaughn nodded and moved to the cellar steps. He pushed against the doors, which now felt heavier than before. With a grunt of effort, he forced them open. Rain fell steadily from a sky that was already beginning to clear in patches. Hazel climbed up behind Vaughn and emerged into a world transformed. Her farmhouse, the only home she had ever known, was gone, reduced to scattered timber and broken furniture. The barn had collapsed in on itself. Fence posts had been ripped from the ground and hurled across the property. One of her father's wagons lay upside down nearly 50 yards from where it had been parked. Hazel stood motionless, staring at the destruction. Everything was gone. Everything except the items she had grabbed in those frantic moments before seeking shelter. "I'm sorry," Vaughn said quietly beside her. A sob broke from her throat, the first crack in the dam of her composure. Then another. And suddenly she was weeping openly, her shoulders shaking with the force of her grief. Without hesitation, Vaughn placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, offering what comfort he could to this woman he had only just met. She turned instinctively toward him, and he opened his arms, allowing her to bury her face against his chest as she cried. "It's all gone," she whispered against his rain-dampened shirt. "Everything my parents built, everything we had left." "You're alive," Vaughn reminded her, his voice low and steady. "That's what matters most." Hazel drew back, wiping her eyes. "Yes, thanks to you." She looked around at the devastation. "I don't even know where to begin." Vaughn surveyed the wreckage. "First things first. Let's see if we can find your livestock. Then we'll salvage what we can before dark." Hazel stared at him, surprised by his assumption that he would stay and help. "Mr. Lawson, I can't ask you to. You didn't ask," he interrupted gently. "And it's Vaughn. I reckon we're beyond formalities after sharing a storm cellar during a twister." A ghost of a smile touched Hazel's lips. "I suppose we are, Vaughn." His horse had indeed broken free as he'd predicted, and was found sheltering in a stand of trees 100 yards from the house, miraculously unharmed. 3 of Hazel's cows had survived as well, though 2 others were lost. Several chickens had somehow weathered the storm, and her father's old mule was discovered, shaken but alive, in what remained of the corral. As the afternoon wore on, they worked side by side, salvaging what they could from the ruins of the farmhouse. Vaughn demonstrated a quiet competence that Hazel found reassuring. He knew how to stack the usable lumber, how to extract furniture without causing further damage, and how to prioritize what could be saved. "You've done this before," she observed as they took a brief rest, sitting on an overturned water trough and sharing a canteen. Vaughn nodded, his gaze on the horizon. 2 years ago, near El Paso, a tornado took out half the town. I was passing through, stayed to help rebuild." "You seem to do that a lot, pass through places." "It's what I do," he said simply. "Never been one to stay put too long." "Are you running from something or towards something?" Hazel asked, then immediately regretted her forwardness. "I'm sorry, that's none of my business." Vaughn gave her a sidelong glance, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "Bit of both, maybe. I was a Texas Ranger for 5 years, saw things. Did things that didn't sit right with me in the end. So I handed in my badge and started riding. Been doing odd jobs, ranch work mostly, moving on when the urge takes me." Hazel studied him with new understanding. There was a watchfulness about him, a readiness that spoke of someone accustomed to danger. But there was gentleness, too, in the way he had held her in the cellar, in how carefully he handled the few intact photographs they had found among the ruins. "And what about you?" Vaughn asked. "You mentioned your parents built this place, but you were alone when the storm hit." Hazel looked away. "My mother died 3 years ago. Fever. My father's in Tucson, trying to secure a loan to save the ranch. The drought's been hard on everyone, but especially small spreads like ours." She gestured to the destruction around them. "Though I suppose that's all academic now." "Your father will be back soon. Day after tomorrow, if all went well." Hazel sighed. "I don't know how I'll tell him about all this." Vaughn was silent for a moment, then stood. "We've got enough daylight left to rig up some kind of shelter. You can't sleep in the open, and that storm cellar's no place to spend the night." By sunset, they had constructed a makeshift lean-to using salvaged wood and canvas. It wasn't much, but it would keep the dew off and provide some privacy. Vaughn built a small fire nearby and prepared a simple meal from the provisions in his saddlebags and what they had rescued from the root cellar. As they ate, Hazel found herself studying this stranger who had so dramatically entered her life. In the firelight, she could see his features more clearly, the strong line of his jaw, the slight crook in his nose that suggested it had been broken at least once, the way his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck where it escaped his hat. "You're staring, Miss Donovan," he said without looking up from his plate. Hazel felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm trying to figure you out, Mr. Lawson. Most men would have moved on by now, especially with nothing to gain from staying." Vaughn met her gaze across the fire. "Would you rather I left?" "No," she admitted. "I'm grateful for your help. I'm not used to kindness without strings attached." Something flickered in his eyes, understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a shared wariness about the world. "Get some rest," he said finally. "I'll keep watch for a while." Hazel retreated to the lean-to, wrapping herself in the blanket Vaughn had given her from his own bedroll. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her. Through the open side of the shelter, she could see Vaughn's silhouette against the night sky, steady and vigilant. She wondered what path had truly led him to her farmhouse today. What cosmic coincidence had placed him in exactly the right place at the right time to save her life? Whatever the reason, she was grateful and more intrigued by this quiet, capable stranger than she cared to admit. Morning brought clarity and a renewed sense of purpose. Hazel awoke to find Vaughn already up, tending to the animals and starting a small breakfast fire. He had a pot of coffee brewing, the familiar aroma a small comfort amid the destruction. "I've been thinking," he said as he handed her a tin cup of the strong brew. "We should ride into town today, get word to the neighbors. You'll need help rebuilding, and there might be others who were hit by the storm." Hazel nodded, warming her hands around the cup. "Douglas is 15 miles south. We can make it there and back by nightfall if we start soon. You'll need supplies too, food, tools, canvas for a proper tent until you can rebuild." "I have a little money," Hazel said, thinking of the cash box she had saved from the house. "Not much, but enough for essentials." Vaughn hesitated, then spoke carefully. "I have some savings. I'd be happy to—" "No," Hazel interrupted firmly. "You've done more than enough already, Mr. Lawson. I won't take your money." He seemed about to argue, then nodded in acceptance of her pride. "Fair enough. But I'm staying to help with the rebuilding, at least until your father returns." Hazel wanted to refuse this offer of extended assistance as well, but practicality won out over pride. She couldn't manage alone, and Vaughn had already proven himself both capable and trustworthy. "Thank you," she said simply. They set out for Douglas an hour later, Hazel riding her father's mule and Vaughn on his horse, Maestro. The journey gave Hazel time to reflect on the sudden upheaval in her life. Yesterday morning, she had been worrying about the drought and the mortgage. Now her home was gone, and she was traveling with a man she barely knew but on whom she had become utterly dependent. "Tell me about your ranch," Vaughn said after they had ridden in companionable silence for several miles. "Before the drought, I mean." Hazel smiled, grateful for the distraction from her darker thoughts. "It wasn't much compared to the big spreads, but it was profitable enough. 30 head of cattle, 2 good breeding bulls, a small orchard that my mother planted. My father came out here from Pennsylvania in '70, met my mother in Tucson where she was teaching school and convinced her that ranching was a grand adventure." "And was it? A grand adventure?" "It was hard work," Hazel replied honestly, "but there were good years. Before my mother got sick before the drought, we were happy. And after the drought ends, what then?" Hazel had been asking herself the same question. "I don't know. My father's not young anymore. This setback, I'm not sure he can start over again." Vaughn nodded thoughtfully. "And what about you? What would you do if you could choose?" The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked what she wanted. It had always been assumed she would remain on the ranch, eventually marry a local boy, and continue the life her parents had built. "I like to raid," she said finally. "I used to dream of going east to school, maybe becoming a teacher like my mother was, but that was childish fantasy." "Why?" Vaughn challenged gently. "Seems to me a woman smart enough to run a ranch could manage a schoolroom just fine." Hazel glanced at him, surprised by his support of such an unconventional ambition. Most men she knew believed a woman's place was in the home, not pursuing education or a profession. "Perhaps," she allowed, "but dreams cost money, and that's in short supply these days." They reached Douglas by midday. The small town showed no signs of damage from the storm, but news of tornadoes in the region had already spread. When Hazel explained what had happened to her farm, the townspeople immediately rallied with offers of assistance. The general store owner, Mr. Finch, extended credit for supplies. The blacksmith promised to ride out the next day to help with salvage and rebuilding. Even the banker, normally a stern and unsympathetic man, expressed concern and suggested Hazel's father come see him about an emergency loan when he returned. Throughout it all, Vaughn remained at her side, a quiet, supportive presence. He added practical suggestions about what supplies would be most useful, arranged for delivery of lumber and tools, and somehow managed to negotiate better prices without seeming to haggle. "Your friend is quite resourceful, Mrs." Finch commented to Hazel while they were selecting fabric for a temporary tent. "And handsome too, if you don't mind my saying." Hazel felt herself blush. "He's not. We're not. He just happened to be passing by when the storm hit." Mrs. Finch raised an eyebrow. "Providence works in mysterious ways, dear. My Herbert was just passing through when his horse threw a shoe outside my father's forge, 32 years ago this June." Before Hazel could respond to this thinly veiled suggestion, Vaughn approached with a list of additional supplies he thought they might need. "The mercantile is sending a wagon of lumber out tomorrow," he informed her. "And I've arranged for some help from the Cooper boys for the heavy lifting." "I don't know how to thank you for all this," Hazel said. Overwhelmed by his efficiency, Vaughn's expression softened. "You can thank me by not giving up on that ranch, or on your dreams." Their eyes held for a moment longer than necessary, and Hazel felt an unfamiliar flutter in her chest. She looked away first, suddenly very interested in the bolts of canvas before her. They left Douglas with their immediate supplies loaded on the mule and promises of more help to come the following day. The ride back was quieter, both of them tired from the day's exertions and lost in their own thoughts. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape, Hazel found herself studying Vaughn's profile against the golden light. There was something compelling about him beyond his obvious physical attributes, a depth of character, a sense of purpose that she found increasingly attractive. "You're staring again, Miss Donovan," he said, the corner of his mouth quirking up in a half-smile. Caught, Hazel decided honesty was her only recourse. "I was just thinking that whoever or whatever sent you my way yesterday, I'm grateful." Vaughn's smile broadened slightly. "As am I." The simple statement hung in the air between them, laden with meaning neither was ready to explore. They arrived back at the ruined farmstead just as twilight was deepening into night. After tending to the animals, they improved their makeshift camp, creating a more substantial temporary shelter with the supplies they had purchased. Over a simple dinner, Hazel found the courage to ask the question that had been on her mind all day. "What will you do after? After this is all over? After we rebuild and my father returns?" Vaughn poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. "Hadn't thought that far ahead," he admitted. "I was headed to California when I spotted the storm. Thought I might try my luck in the gold country." "A ranger turned prospector," Hazel teased gently. "That's quite a change of profession," he chuckled, the sound warm in the cool evening air. "I'm not much for planning. I tend to follow my instincts, see where the trail leads." "And where do your instincts say to go now?" Hazel asked, her voice softer than she intended. Vaughn looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the fire. "Right now, they're telling me to stay put a while." The days that followed fell into a rhythm of hard work and gradual progress. True to their word, the townspeople came to help, bringing supplies, food, and willing hands. Under Vaughn's quiet but effective direction, they began clearing the debris and laying the foundation for a new house. Hazel found herself working alongside Vaughn most days, impressed by his knowledge of construction and his natural leadership. The other men deferred to him without question, recognizing his expertise and appreciating his fair division of labor. At night, exhausted but satisfied with their progress, they would sit by the fire and talk. Vaughn shared stories of his ranger days, the more light-hearted ones, she suspected, and his travels across the territory. Hazel told him about her childhood on the ranch, her mother's love of books, and her father's determination to make something of their small piece of land. On the fourth day after the tornado, as they were taking a brief rest in the shade of a cottonwood tree, Hazel noticed Vaughn studying a piece of paper he'd pulled from his pocket. "What's that?" she asked, offering him a dipper of water from the bucket they kept in the shade. He hesitated, then handed her the paper. It was a wanted poster, worn and creased from being folded and unfolded many times. The face on it was that of a hard-looking man with a scar across his cheek. The reward offered was substantial $1,000 for James Scarface Miller, wanted for murder and robbery in 3 territories. "You're hunting him?" Hazel asked, handing the poster back. Vaughn nodded, folding the paper carefully and returning it to his pocket. He was part of a gang that hit a stagecoach outside Amarillo last year, killed the driver and a passenger, a young woman traveling to her wedding. His voice hardened. "I was part of the ranger company that tracked them. We caught the others, but he slipped away." "And you've been following him since?" "When I can. I get word of sightings, follow the trail until it goes cold. Last I heard, he was headed west, possibly to California. That's why I was headed that way when the storm hit." Hazel absorbed this information, seeing Vaughn in a new light. "So you're not just wandering, you have a purpose." "I made a promise to that woman's fiancé," Vaughn said quietly. "Said I wouldn't rest until Miller faced justice." "That's admirable," Hazel said, "but it sounds like a lonely path." Vaughn's gaze met hers. "It has been, until recently." The implication of his words hung in the air between them, a tentative acknowledgement of the connection that had been growing since that first moment in the storm cellar. Before Hazel could respond, a shout went up from one of the workers. A rider was approaching from the south, her father, returning from Tucson. Thomas Donovan was a man weathered by years of hard work and western sun, his once robust frame now leaner but still strong. As he took in the destruction and the rebuilding efforts, his face showed shock, then grief, and finally determination. Hazel ran to him as he dismounted, throwing her arms around him in relief and joy. "Papa, thank God you're safe. What happened here?" he asked, holding her at arm's length to study her face. "Are you hurt?" "A tornado," she explained. 4 days ago, it took everything, but I'm fine. Mr. Lawson, Vaughn, he saved me, got me to the storm cellar just in time." Thomas turned to Vaughn, who had approached more slowly, giving father and daughter space for their reunion. The older man extended his hand. "Seems I owe you a debt I can never repay, Mr. Lawson." Vaughn shook his hand firmly. "No debt, sir. Just glad I was passing by when I was needed." Thomas looked around at the men working on the new house frame. "And all this, you organized this too?" "Your daughter did most of it," Vaughn corrected. "The people in town think highly of you both. They were eager to help." Thomas's eyes misted slightly. "I've been riding hard for days, worried sick about Hazel alone during the storms. Never imagined I'd come home to this." He gestured to the destroyed farmhouse, then to the new construction rising from the ruins. "Loss and hope all at once. How did you fare in Tucson, Papa?" Hazel asked, leading him to the shade where they could talk. Thomas sighed, removing his hat and wiping his brow. "Not well, I'm afraid. The bank wouldn't extend our loan, said the drought made cattle ranching too risky an investment." Hazel's heart sank. Without capital to rebuild properly and restock their herd, the future looked bleak indeed. "There might be another way," Vaughn said, joining them after instructing the workers to continue in his absence. The banker in Douglas mentioned an emergency loan program when we were in town for families affected by natural disasters. Thomas looked skeptical. Jenkins at the Douglas Bank. He's never been friendly to small ranchers. The tornado changed things, Hazel explained. He seemed genuinely concerned when I told him what happened, said to bring you by when you returned. It's worth trying, Vaughn added. And if that doesn't work out, there are other options. The territory sometimes offers land grants to homesteaders willing to try new farming methods, drought-resistant crops, irrigation systems. Thomas studied the younger man with newfound respect. You seem to know a lot about territorial affairs for someone just passing through. Vaughn shrugged. I listen more than I talk, picks up useful information that way. Over dinner that night, Thomas shared news from Tucson political developments, cattle prices, rumors of new railroad lines coming through the territory. Vaughn listened intently, occasionally asking questions that revealed his sharp mind and broad knowledge. Hazel observed the growing rapport between the two men with quiet pleasure. Her father had always been a good judge of character, and his evident approval of Vaughn confirmed her own positive impressions. After Thomas retired to the tent they had set up for him, Hazel and Vaughn remained by the fire. The night was clear, stars scattered across the velvet darkness like diamond dust. Your father's a good man, Vaughn said. I can see where you get your determination. Hazel smiled. He's always been my hero. After my mother died, he could have given up, sold the ranch, taken an easier path, but he kept going for me. And now you keep going for him. We keep going for each other, she corrected. That's what family does. Vaughn was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames. I wouldn't know much about that. My mother died when I was young. My father. He paused. Let's just say he wasn't the kind of man who inspired loyalty. Hazel wanted to reach out to offer comfort for the old pain she heard in his voice, but something in his posture held her back. Is that why you became a ranger? Looking for a different kind of family? Vaughn looked up, surprised by her insight. Maybe. Never thought of it that way. The Rangers were brothers of a sort, men you could trust with your life. And now, who do you trust now? His eyes met hers, steady and intent. I'm starting to remember what it feels like, to trust, to want to stay somewhere instead of always moving on. Hazel's heart quickened. Vaughn, he stood abruptly, breaking the moment. It's late. We should get some rest. Lots of work to do tomorrow. Confused by his sudden withdrawal, Hazel nodded and rose as well. Good night, then. Good night, Hazel. As she made her way to her tent, Hazel replayed their conversation in her mind, wondering what had caused him to pull away just as it seemed they were growing closer. Perhaps he regretted suggesting he might stay. Perhaps he remembered his mission to find the outlaw Miller and realized his path still lay elsewhere. Whatever the reason, Hazel resolved not to let herself grow too attached to this enigmatic man who had ridden into her life on the winds of disaster. He had already given her more than she could have asked for her life, his help, his companionship during the darkest days she had ever faced. To expect more would be selfish and unrealistic. The following days brought steady progress on the new house and a tentative new beginning for the ranch. Thomas Donovan rode into Douglas with Vaughn and returned with cautious optimism. Jenkins agreed to a small loan, he told Hazel that evening. Enough to finish the house and buy some breeding stock. It's a start. That's wonderful news, Papa, Hazel exclaimed, embracing him. Your friend Vaughn can be mighty persuasive, Thomas said, glancing toward where the younger man was helping to unload supplies from a wagon. Seems he knows quite a bit about territorial law and banking regulations. Jenkins wasn't inclined to be generous until Vaughn mentioned certain incentives the territorial government offers banks that support recovery efforts. Hazel smiled. He's full of surprises. That he is, Thomas agreed thoughtfully. You two have grown close. It wasn't a question, but Hazel felt compelled to clarify. He saved my life, Papa, and he's been nothing but helpful and respectful. I didn't suggest otherwise, Thomas said mildly. I was merely observing that he seems to care for you and you for him. Hazel flushed. He'll be moving on soon. He has obligations elsewhere. Does he now? That's not the impression I got from our conversations. Before Hazel could ask what he meant, they were interrupted by the arrival of more neighbors bringing food and offers of help. The moment for private conversation passed, but her father's words lingered in her mind. That night, while most of the workers had returned to their own homes and Thomas had retired early, exhausted from the day's labor, Hazel found Vaughn sitting alone by the fire, staring up at the stars. "May I join you?" she asked softly. He looked up, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "Of course." Hazel settled beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of his presence but not so close as to presume an intimacy they had not established. "I wanted to thank you again for helping with the bank. Papa says we wouldn't have gotten the loan without your intervention." Vaughn shrugged. Jenkins just needed a reminder of where his best interests lay. The loan makes good business sense. Still, you didn't have to involve yourself in our affairs. You've already done more than enough. He turned to look at her directly. Is that your way of saying it's time for me to move on? No. The word came out more forcefully than she intended. No, she repeated more softly. I don't want you to feel obligated to stay. And if I want to stay, the question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither had voiced until now. Hazel took a deep breath. Why would you want to stay? You have a mission, that outlaw you're tracking, the promise you made. Vaughn was silent for a long moment. I received word yesterday. Miller was caught in Yuma last week, tried to rob a bank, got himself shot by the sheriff. So your quest is over, Hazel said, understanding dawning. You're free to go to California as you planned. I'm free to go anywhere, he corrected. Or to stay if I had reason enough. Hazel's heart beat faster. And do you have reason enough? Vaughn reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, and took her hand in his. I'm starting to think so. If you'll let me, I'd like to help finish rebuilding your home. And then we can see where things lead. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't even a promise. But for two people who had known each other less than 2 weeks, who had met in the midst of chaos and destruction, it was a beginning, a seedling of possibility that might, with care and time, grow into something strong and enduring. I'd like that, Hazel said softly, turning her hand in his so their palms met, fingers intertwining. They sat together in companionable silence as the fire burned low, neither feeling the need to rush what was developing between them. There would be time for words, time for decisions. For now, it was enough to acknowledge the connection they shared and the future that might await them. The weeks that followed were filled with hard work and gradual healing. The new house took shape, smaller than the original but solid and well built. The community continued to rally around the Donovans, bringing what they could spare to help the family rebuild their lives. Vaughn stayed, becoming an integral part of the reconstruction effort and, increasingly, a part of their daily lives. He worked alongside Thomas in the fields, helped Hazel replant her mother's herb garden, and in the evenings shared stories and laughter around the dinner table as if he had always belonged there. Hazel found herself watching him when he didn't notice, admiring the easy way he carried himself, the quiet competence with which he approached every task. The kindness he showed to everyone from the youngest child to the oldest elder who came to help. And sometimes she would catch him watching her too, his expression thoughtful and tender in a way that made her heart skip a beat. One evening, nearly a month after the tornado, Hazel was sitting on the porch of the nearly completed house, enjoying the cooler air after a hot day of work. Vaughn joined her, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "Your father says we should be able to move the furniture in by week's end," he said, handing her one of the cups. Hazel smiled. "It's hard to believe how much we've accomplished in such a short time. You Donovans are nothing if not determined." "We've had help," she reminded him. "Especially yours." Vaughn sipped his coffee, his gaze on the distant mountains where the setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "I received a letter today from an old ranger friend in Austin." Hazel's heart sank. "Oh." She managed to keep her voice even. "Good news, I hope. He's offered me a position. The Rangers are forming a special unit to deal with cross-border rustling. He thinks my experience would be valuable." "That sounds like quite an opportunity," Hazel said carefully, trying to hide her disappointment. "When would you need to leave?" Vaughn turned to face her. "I haven't decided if I'm going." Hope fluttered in her chest. "What's holding you back?" His eyes held hers steadily. "I think you know, Hazel." The use of her first name, spoken with such quiet intimacy, sent a shiver through her. "I don't want to keep you from your duty if that's where you feel called to go. And if I feel called to stay. If I'm beginning to think that this place that you might be where I belong." Hazel set her coffee cup aside, her hand suddenly unsteady. "Vaughn, we've only known each other a short time. I wouldn't want you to make a decision you might regret." He reached for her hand, his touch gentle but sure. "I've spent years moving from place to place, never putting down roots. But from the moment I saw that tornado bearing down on your farm, something changed. Call it fate or providence or just dumb luck, but I was meant to be here. I was meant to find you. And if you stay," Hazel whispered. "What then?" "Then I help you and your father make this ranch thrive again. I learned to be a rancher instead of a ranger. I wake up every morning knowing exactly where I belong and who I want to be with." He paused, his gaze never leaving hers. "If that's what you want too." Hazel felt tears welling in her eyes. "I do. I want that more than I've wanted anything in a very long time." Vaughn's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. When she didn't, he closed the distance between them, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was both tender and filled with promise. When they finally parted, Hazel felt as though the world had shifted beneath her feet, everything familiar yet somehow transformed. "I should probably speak to your father," Vaughn said, his voice husky. "Ask his blessing." Hazel laughed softly. "Papa's been expecting this conversation for weeks now. I think he had you measured for a son-in-law the day you two went to town together." "Smart man, your father," Vaughn said with a grin. "Though I hope we can take a little time, court properly before we talk of marriage." "I'd like that," Hazel agreed. "We have all the time in the world now." As if summoned by their conversation, Thomas Donovan appeared in the doorway. He took in their clasped hands and the glow in his daughter's eyes, and a slow smile spread across his weathered face. "About time you two figured things out," he said gruffly. "Was beginning to think I'd have to lock you in the barn together to get some straight talk happening." Vaughn stood, still holding Hazel's hand. "Mr. Donovan, I'd like your permission to court your daughter, with the intention of asking for her hand when the time is right." Thomas pretended to consider this request seriously, though the twinkle in his eyes gave him away. "Well, I suppose you've proven yourself handy in a crisis. Can't build worth a damn, but Hazel seems fond of you despite that." "Papa," Hazel protested, laughing. "Fine, fine. Thomas relented, extending his hand to Vaughn. "You have my blessing. But hurt her, and tornado or no tornado, you'll wish you'd never ridden onto this ranch." "Yes, sir," Vaughn agreed solemnly, shaking the older man's hand. "That's a promise I intend to keep." As summer gave way to autumn, the ranch began to resemble its former self. The house was completed, furnished with a mixture of salvaged items and new pieces crafted by a carpenter in Douglas. A small herd of cattle grazed in the pastures, and plans were underway for expanding their operations in the spring. Vaughn had settled into ranch life with surprising ease for a man who had spent years on the move. He had a natural affinity for the work, a patience with the animals, and a willingness to learn that impressed even the most experienced ranchers in the area. More importantly, he and Hazel had grown closer with each passing day. Their courtship was conducted under Thomas's watchful, but approving eye-long rides across the property, quiet evenings on the porch, Sunday gatherings with neighbors where they sat side by side, their shoulders touching, their hands finding each other's when they thought no one was looking. One crisp October evening, Vaughn asked Hazel to accompany him on a ride to a spot he discovered on the far edge of the property, a small mesa overlooking a valley, where the sunset painted the landscape in breathtaking colors. "It's beautiful here," Hazel said as they dismounted, and Vaughn spread a blanket on the ground for them to sit. "I found it last week when I was checking the north fence line," he explained. "Thought you might appreciate the view." They sat together, Hazel leaning comfortably against Vaughn's shoulder as they watched the sun sink toward the horizon. The air was cool but not cold, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. "Happy?" Vaughn asked softly. Hazel nodded. "Happier than I ever expected to be again after the tornado. Sometimes I think that storm, terrible as it was, brought me the greatest gift of my life." "And what's that?" Vaughn asked, though the warmth in his eyes suggested he already knew her answer. "You," she said simply. "Us." "This new beginning," Vaughn shifted, turning to face her more directly. "I've been thinking about beginnings," he said, "and about futures." Something in his tone made Hazel's heart beat faster. "Have you?" He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that caught the last rays of the setting sun. A ring, simple but beautiful, a gold band with a small pearl set in the center. "I know we agreed to take our time," he said, his voice steady despite the nervousness she could see in his eyes. "But these past months have only confirmed what I suspected from the start. I love you, Hazel Donovan. I want to build a life with you, here on this land that means so much to you." Tears blurred Hazel's vision as she looked from the ring to Vaughn's face. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I started falling in love with you the moment you held me in that storm cellar, when the whole world was falling apart around us. Then will you marry me? Be my wife, my partner, the mother of our children someday?" "Yes," Hazel said without hesitation. "Yes to all of it." Vaughn slipped the ring onto her finger, then cupped her face in his hands and kissed her with a tenderness that spoke of all the years they would share, all the storms they would weather together, all the joys they would discover in each other's arms. When they returned to the ranch house, hand in hand and glowing with happiness, Thomas took one look at them and burst into a wide grin. "Well, it's about time," he exclaimed, embracing Hazel and clapping Vaughn on the shoulder. "When's the wedding to be?" "We thought perhaps Christmas," Hazel said, looking to Vaughn for confirmation. "If that's not too soon," Thomas nodded approvingly. "Plenty of time to prepare, but not so long that this fellow might change his mind and go chasing outlaws again." "No chance of that, sir," Vaughn assured him. "My wandering days are behind me." The news of their engagement spread quickly through the community. Mrs. Finch from the general store immediately appointed herself unofficial wedding coordinator, arriving at the ranch with fabric samples and cake recipes. The church ladies formed committees to handle decorations and music. Even Jenkins from the bank sent a surprisingly generous gift, a pair of fine breeding heifers to strengthen their herd. As the wedding day approached, Hazel found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment of happiness. Less than 6 months ago, she had stood on her porch watching a funnel cloud bear down on everything she held dear, certain that her life was about to end. Instead, it had been transformed in ways she could never have imagined. The morning of Christmas Eve dawned clear and cold, the winter sun casting a golden glow over the frost-covered landscape. In the small church in Douglas, decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons for both Christmas and the wedding, Hazel stood beside her father, ready to begin her new life. "Your mother would be so proud," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion as he prepared to walk her down the aisle. "She always wanted this for you, not just marriage, but love. Real love." "I know, Papa," Hazel replied, squeezing his arm. "I feel her with us today." The music began, Mrs. Cooper at the organ playing a hymn that had been Hazel's mother's favorite. The congregation rose as Hazel and her father began their walk toward the altar where Vaughn waited, his eyes never leaving hers, his face alight with love and wonder. When Thomas placed Hazel's hand in Vaughn's, the circle that had begun in chaos and destruction on that stormy day seemed somehow complete. From the moment he had pulled her into the storm cellar and held her tight against the fury of the tornado, their lives had been intertwined, their futures linked. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, his voice carrying through the small church, "we are gathered here in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." As they spoke their vows, promising to love and cherish each other through all the seasons of their lives, Hazel felt a profound sense of rightness, of having found her true home not in a place, but in a person. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister concluded. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Vaughn's kiss was gentle yet filled with promise, the first of countless such kisses they would share as they built their life together. The celebration that followed at the ranch was joyous and warm despite the winter chill. Neighbors and friends gathered to share in their happiness, bringing food and gifts and good wishes. There was dancing in the barn, cleared and decorated for the occasion, and laughter that seemed to chase away the memories of harder times. Late that night, after the last guests had departed and Thomas had tactfully retired to a neighbor's house to give the newlyweds privacy, Hazel and Vaughn stood on the porch of their home, gazing up at the star-filled sky. "Happy?" Vaughn asked, his arms wrapped around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. "Perfectly," she replied, leaning back against his solid warmth. "Do you ever think about how close we came to never meeting? If you had taken a different trail that day, if the storm had come an hour earlier or later." "I don't believe in coincidences," Vaughn said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I was meant to find you. Maybe everything in my life, becoming a ranger, tracking Miller, all those years of wandering, was just the path that was leading me to you." Hazel turned in his arms to face him. "Well, I'm very glad your path led you here, Vaughn Lawson, and I plan to make sure it never leads you away again." "That's a promise I'm happy to keep, Mrs. Lawson," he replied, bending to kiss her with all the love that had grown between them since that first desperate embrace in the storm cellar. As the years passed, the Lawson ranch flourished under their combined care and determination. The drought eventually broke, bringing renewed life to the land. Their herds increased, their crops thrived, and their home became known throughout the territory for its warmth and hospitality. 2 years after their wedding, Hazel gave birth to their first child, a son they named Thomas, after her father, who doted on his grandson with unabashed delight. A daughter followed 3 years later, named Elizabeth after Vaughn's mother. Through it all, the joys and challenges, the good years and the difficult ones, Hazel and Vaughn remained steadfast in their love for each other. The bond that had formed between them in those desperate moments during the tornado only deepened with time, strengthened by shared dreams and mutual respect. Sometimes, when a summer storm would gather on the horizon, they would stand together on their porch and watch the distant lightning, remembering the day that had changed their lives forever. And Vaughn would pull Hazel close, just as he had in that storm cellar, holding on tight as if to say that whatever winds might come, they would face them together. On their 20th wedding anniversary, with their children nearly grown and the ranch more prosperous than ever, Vaughn surprised Hazel with a small wooden box he had crafted himself. "What's this?" she asked, opening it to find a piece of weathered wood inside. "It's from the original farmhouse," he explained. "I found it the day after the tornado and kept it. I wanted you to have a piece of where we began." Tears filled Hazel's eyes as she touched the fragment of her past, a tangible reminder of both what had been lost and what had been found on that fateful day. "The tornado took away my home," she said softly, "but it gave me you. I'd make that trade 1,000 times over." "As would I," Vaughn agreed, gathering her into his arms. "Every storm, every struggle, every moment of doubt, all worth it to be here with you." And as they stood together in the home they had built from the ruins, surrounded by the life they had created together, they knew with absolute certainty that some things were strong enough to withstand any storm, and that the love they shared was chief among them. From destruction had come creation. From chaos, order. From a moment of desperate survival in a storm cellar, a lifetime of love and purpose. And neither of them would have changed a single moment of the journey that had brought them to this place of perfect belonging.